Bon dia. Good morning. I'm very pleased and very proud of introducing you both because I think you are very relevant people in the field of research in e-learning and particularly in quality and organizational issues. That is one of the focus in which I feel more comfortable also researching. And particularly for me, it's absolutely pleasing to introduce you in this kind of seminar. So I will use English and Catalan anyway in order to present you. Els professors Collis i Moonen tenen un element comú que em sembla que és interessant també de destacar, no? A banda de que, diguéssim, la seva vida personal i professional ha seguit també el mateix camí, tots dos van començar treballant en l'àmbit de l'educació per les matemàtiques, en llocs diferents i en moments diferents, en institucions diferents, però curiosament després han coincidit. No? So I'm saying that even if you have developed a path together, not only personally but also professionally, the most important and highlighting point is that both of you started working on mathematics, education and mathematics together. So in different countries, at different moments, in different institutions, but in the same way. So it's a very, very, not curious, but particular issue that I think that it could be highlighted. Particularment la professora Collis és americana i canadenca. Té les dues nacionalitats. Ella va néixer als Estats Units, va desenvolupar el seu bachelor a Michigan en matemàtiques, va fer el màster a Stanford en educació per a les matemàtiques i després va desenvolupar el seu PhD a la Universitat de Victòria, al Canadà, sobre aspectes de mesura i avaluació de les aplicacions informàtiques en l'educació i en la formació. Posteriorment, ella va estar com a professora durant un període de temps com a professora a la Universitat de Victòria, al Canadà també, i més tard, ja l'any 88, va passar a ser una professora de la Facultat d'Educational Science and Technology a la Universitat de Twente, a Holanda. Una facultat molt curiosa. I also want to point out the fact of this kind of faculty of Educational Science and Technology was probably the first one that linked both fields, technology and pedagogy, working together. And at this particular moment, it was a very pioneering way of working together both fields of knowledge. Ha estat sempre un referent aquesta facultat de la Universitat de Twente. Posteriorment es va desfer com a tal facultat. Això no vol dir que no funcionés bé, però ja sabeu que els aspectes organitzatius, no cal que us ho expliqui aquí, no? Doncs tenen molta mobilitat i des d'allà va ser on va treballar conjuntament amb el professor Moonen, amb una sèrie de projectes de recerca vinculats fonamentalment a les aplicacions de la tecnologia per l'estratègia, l'aprenentatge i el canvi de les organitzacions educatives i també particularment de la formació en els àmbits corporatius de l'empresa. Va liderar, diguéssim, un projecte de recerca col·laboratiu de 5 anys que va tenir molt impacte a nivell internacional des del punt de vista de la formació corporativa, que va ser tot el projecte desenvolupat a Shell, la fàbrica, l'empresa petroliera, on va desenvolupar tot un sistema d'aprenentatge i lideratge del desenvolupament de la pròpia organització en aquesta institució. Bé, van estar tots dos també treballant conjuntament en aquest àmbit. El professor Moonen, ell és belga, però posteriorment ha desenvolupat una part de la seva formació també a Holanda. Va fer els seus primers estudis de matemàtiques i educació a la Universitat de Lovaina, Leuven, i després, posteriorment, el seu doctorat el va desenvolupar a la Universitat de Leiden, a Holanda, amb una tesi vinculada a l'educació basada a l'educació estadística a través de l'ús de la informàtica, dels computadors. Ell ha estat professor d'Educational Instrumentation a aquesta facultat de Pedagogia i Tecnologia que he comentat abans de Twente, i bàsicament els seus interessos de recerca s'han anat concentrant en els aspectes de política i implementació d'aquestes polítiques en la introducció, en la integració de les tecnologies, de la informació i de la comunicació en l'educació i la formació. Podríem continuar parlant, i jo crec que cal destacar també almenys dos llibres que a mi em sembla que han identificat un moment important. I would like to highlight two of your publications, two books. There are not only two books, there are a lot of publications, but I think that we can point out two of them because particularly for me are two very important books in the process even of creation of this university. The first one was the one called, un moment, que no vull equivocar-me amb el títol perquè després com que tenen noms a vegades similars doncs em puc equivocar. Sí, el primer és un llibre que va ser molt important perquè en l'any 95, quan vam néixer nosaltres, s'estava escrivint, es va publicar l'any 96 i va ser un llibre de referència en aquells moments, que és el que s'anomena Telelearning in a Digital World, The Future of Distance Learning. En aquell moment nosaltres estàvem naixent com a universitat, ens veiem com una universitat a distància que volíem utilitzar al màxim els elements digitals, doncs el llibre de Betty Collis va ser un llibre, it was a book that served us a lot in order to develop even our university in the sense of having a benchmark in which we can look at it and develop our own organization. I el segon és una mica més recent, de l'any 2001, però m'agradaria destacar-lo també, escrit conjuntament per ells dos, que és el que es titula Flexible Learning in a Digital World, Experiences and Expectations. Els dos identifiquen, diguéssim, aquest camí, aquest treball d'utilització de l'e-learning, abans dit de l'educació a distància amb la tecnologia, ara parlem bàsicament d'e-learning, però identifiquen aquesta evolució que ha hagut durant aquests anys i que ells hi han treballat, i particularment, posteriorment s'han concentrat també en aspectes de qualitat de l'e-learning, com avui ens oferiran en la sessió que ens presenten. So, again, thank you very much for your attention, for attending this seminar, for helping us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. And good morning. Jeff and I would have a plan for our time. We will have 3 general sections to our reflections. In each one of them, I will present some general comments, and then Jeff will illustrate them with some PhD dissertations that we've brought with us. We brought with us 15 or 16, 15 dissertations that we will leave with you, and we hope that you can make use of them as examples. They're all dissertations from the University of Twente, which one or the other of us supervised, or sometimes both of us. We have many more, more than hundreds more, but these were ones that we have doubles of that we brought with you. So Jeff will illustrate my more conceptual points with examples. And we would like very much to have you ask questions or respond or interact as much as you like. So to begin, the first of the 3 parts we decided to focus on the general process and product of PhD research. We know that there are many different ways that research can be designed and developed. Even in the social sciences, there are many different ways. We will mostly talk about what we are most familiar with the type of research we've supervised over the years. So I will make general comments, but that doesn't mean that every dissertation must be like this. It's just an overview that we have. To me, an important starting point, and it's usually not the starting point of your work, it doesn't come till later, to formulate a question. To me, it's not enough to be interested in computer conferencing or interested in reusability of learning objects. A difficult step is to formulate a question. A question means you need an answer. A question means you want to know more about something, you want to understand more about a problem or an issue or a new possibility. So a question starts with a word like how or what or why. It's a step beyond having a topic. Usually this question relates to something that eventually you'd like to improve. You'd like to improve it either by making some problem related to it better managed, or understanding it better, or designing something that will help improve or give insight into your problem. So this is all rather abstract, and I will talk more about it, and then Jeff will illustrate it. But in my way, it's my way of thinking in general about what is your problem, what's the focus or the dependent variable, the thing you want to change, and then what might you do in order to study influences, impact, or change around this variable. So for example, this dependent variable, the thing you want to make better or know more about, it's more than naming a topic. And you need to also, besides talking about it generically, show how it matters from your own context, from your own, the place where you're going to be able to eventually investigate the problem and get data and study it. So you have to see how it also is rooted or grounded in your own base for research. And it's very important that when you talk about this problem, you realize that you're certainly not the first one to think about this problem. If you say, no one has studied this before, I can guarantee you, you're probably wrong. Nothing is new. It may have new names, there may be a new aspect to it, it may be in a different context, but you need to broaden your way of thinking about the problem, and then you'll see that the problem has been around in many different ways before. And then this thing that you hope can influence or impact or change the problem. You may be interested in describing this from a more conceptual point of view, or designing something and seeing if it does in fact lead to the sort of impact that you were interested in. And if so, you need evidence. Evidence-based research is very important. Again, I won't talk more conceptually because Jeff will give illustrations. But finally, all of this needs to be integrated together in a conceptual framework. Somehow or other, you need to relate in an abstract, generic way how your problem is related to the impact or change variables that you're interested in. A model to show the conceptual framework is a very familiar part of a social science research. I think Jeff will show you, we have them in all of our dissertations. Some visualization of the interrelationship, which then you're going to study in more detail, either to strengthen your understanding of it or to change it and challenge it once you've learned more about it. Would you like to show some examples now, or talk about some examples?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to ask some questions to you, if I may. How many of you are PhD candidates? Okay. How many of you are working on the PhD already for more than a year? Okay. Okay. How many of you are almost finishing? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm asking the questions because I want to make a more general point before I really start. The general point is a thing that Betty and I have been written about a lot, many times. You know, it's the value of context. I mean, it's an obvious remark maybe for you, but it's, I think, the most important remark you can make. You know, I think you can only do research well if you are very well aware of the context. And I'm not only mean the scientific context, but, you know, the general context. And therefore, I'm going to talk to you about, you know, we brought 15 dissertations with us. With the exception of 2, we were supervisors or both or separately. And in the other ones, we were involved in the committee and so on. Now, to better, we're going to leave these dissertations for you. I think that another important remark I want to make is learning by example is, I think, very powerful. So I believe in it very well. So it relates to the context, you know. So when you have the example of the context, then you can really make up your own mind and agree or not agree, it doesn't matter, but nevertheless, you know what your limits are. Now, these dissertations that we are going to leave, and I hope you will look at them and circulate them if you want to among each other, they were made, not all of them, but mostly in our department. Now, as was said earlier, you know, we both worked in the Faculty of Educational Science and Technology in Twente. By the way, in the meantime, the name has changed, so but in case you're looking for it, it doesn't exist anymore. It's now called the Faculty of Behavioral Sciences, for all kinds of other reasons. But within that faculty, there were 5 departments. Measurement, let me call it methodology and measurement, data analysis, statistics, instructional technology, curriculum technology, organization and administrative issues, and then there was our department, instrumentation technology. Now, in those days, the phrase e-learning did not exist yet. It became up later. Now, in all these dissertations we brought with us, only 2 of them, I think, have the word e-learning in the title. All the other ones have different titles, but in a way, if you interpret e-learning in a broad way, Betty will come back to that later on, it's all about e-learning in one way or another, if you want to, okay? So those dissertations were in the e-learning is a business from different perspectives, because that was, you know, mostly what we were doing all the time in our department, educational instrumentation. And second remark I want to make is because I know from the things that we studied before, we got some information about, you know, the setup of your PhD program. I understood from, we had to read Catalan, so I'm not so sure if we understood it completely right. I understood that your program is, you know, there is a first phase where you have to follow courses and do an exam, or, you know, and then you have a second phase where you do your research. Is that correct? Okay, that's more the American system. That was not the case in our situation. Or in our situation, a PhD student came in. He could be appointed as an assistant and then was paid, or he came in he was a kind of free candidate who was doing some work. He had a professional life, and then on the side did his PhD. Now, whatever, the point was that in principle, those candidates had 4 years of work to do the PhD. So when you see these books, this candidate, by the way, was doing it besides of his regular work. So don't be surprised about the volumes, because our dissertations are all quite thick. But again, remember that it's 4 years work. So I can imagine that in your situation, things will be more limited because of the time constraint, or not. I don't know. Anyway, just a point. Now to the point about Betty. I think an important issue is indeed the question that you have, and the problem statement that you have. And I will give you, I think, 2 examples or 3 examples of dissertations. This one is called academics in control, and it has to do with supporting personal performance for teaching-related activities. This person was a colleague of ours in our department, and he studied how the use of the web and other online technologies could help or you know, make problems in terms of what the teachers, the instructors has to do in terms of workload. Because I think we all know that you know, the technology that's available, in principle it should reduce our workload. In fact, it does not. It increases the workload. And the question is, a very crucial question is, how to deal with that. Again, Betty will talk about, you know, your time as a central theme in your PhD research, as far I understand. We have to talk about what you mean by time, because it can have different aspects in it. Nevertheless, the time involvement of the instructors in their work, using the technology in their teaching activities, you know, how could that be influenced in a positive way, meaning reducing it or count it, or, and that's what this person did, you know, or can he make a tool, another tool, in order to improve, you know, their activities and their performance. That was the main point of his dissertation. Now, he started, and that's why I going to your problem statement, he started in this first chapter, because in our dissertations, in most of the cases, you know, the first chapter, which is not always very long, it's about the problem statement, and in a way describing the context. I was talking about the context. And this person is talking about the context from different angles. He's talking about the content, the context from the, in the Netherlands, the university context was changing, as it is happening all over the place, all over the world, regularly, I think. So, you know, there were different laws and different constructions of the programs. So, what was the impact of those things on the workload of the teachers? There was also the changing RCT, what he calls the RCT context. You know, technology is moving along all the time. It's changing all the time. It presents, in most cases, new opportunities. That is the responsibility of you know, how the administration looks at the task of the different the instructors. You know, that also is changing all the time. More control or less resources, etc., etc. So he described these things in his first chapter, and then he came up with, and I will read it to you. He came up to his problem. He said, what are the key aspects of academics teaching-related performance that are coming under increased pressure in the changing university context? So that's a general question. And he will go then further, I will come back to that later on, he then go further in chapter 2 by then, in a way, analyzing this global question, and then come up with very precise questions, which I have over here. Eventually he has 7. It depends, of course, of how detailed you want to be in your analysis of your problem statement. Sometimes, you know, like this person did, he did it at the end of his chapter 2. Sometimes a person just goes to 1 or 2 or 3 general questions, and then, in a way, analyzes those questions in the next chapters, and then divide the questions in more detailed questions over there. So it depends. But let me read you to some of his research questions. You know, the one was, what are key aspects of personal performance of academics? If you talk about personal performance, what do you mean by that? I mean, it's an obvious remark, but nevertheless, it has to be described quite precisely. And that's a general remark about you know, what has to be done in a dissertation. Besides of your general problem, you have to come to research questions which then can be answered, but you can also only answer them if they are precise in terms of, you know, you have to know what you're talking about. It cannot be vague or broad. Again, Betty will come back to the whole question about e-learning. If we talk about e-learning, if I talk about e-learning, or you, we probably mean different things by that, as an example. So you have to be very precise. The next research question in this case was, what is the desired personal performance for the current and future teaching-related activities of academics in the changing university context? Again, you know what's going on now, what do you want it to be? For instance, if I'm not sure, if the time issue in his case were that, you know, the time that was spent by the instructors was too much, how can you reduce it? Or maybe the time that they needed was not enough to do what they have to do, and then it has to be more time, but then of course is the time available? So he has to define quite precisely what he means by how do you go to what you think is the future situation. The third question is, what is the current level of personal performance? So after, you know, he defines what it is, what it should be, then he's going to find out what it is right now, so that he knows exactly what the starting point is. If you want to have a measure about, you know, what it will be at the end of your dissertation research, after you have your experiments or whatever you want to do with it, you have to have a comparison, you know. You have to know where you started, so that you can measure what you have at the end and then make the comparison with the beginning, and so on. He talks about criteria, etc., etc. So this is one example, I think a good example of how the build-up of the things that Betty is talking about was done by this person. Another one, but maybe I should stop now.
I'll do one more just for...
Okay. Another one is this one. It's called Telematics Support for Group-Based Learning. So his main problem was, and he starts in the beginning, I'm reading again. The goal of this PhD research is to identify the problems associated with the educational paradigm of group-based learning, and to identify and explore a number of telematic support options that seem to offer solutions to these problems. So there are tools that support group-based learning. The question is which are available, and do they really help, or do we have to make a new one? And eventually he suggested a new one. So that's another problem that was on the basis of his dissertation. He came up with 4 global research questions. The first one was, what are the main problems that occur in group-based learning with respect to the planning, operationalization, and monitoring of the work? Again, he wants to make sure that you understand the problem. So he can say there are problems, okay, but what are the problems in more precise terms? The second question was, to what extent and in what circumstances can telematic support tools and instructional methods that make use of such tools help instructors and students to better plan, operationalize, and monitor group-based activities in higher education? So what are the, in a way, he's trying to focus on the context. In what circumstances can these tools be helpful? The third question was, what factors have to be taken into account when mapping the requirements identified in question 1 and 2 with the tools and methods that are available? So in a way, he tried to then combine the two analyses he made in his first and in his first chapters to make an analysis of what has to be done. And then the fourth question then is, what implications does this analysis have for telematic services, infrastructure, and support? In a way, he is preparing here the fact that he is going to devise another tool. As a matter of fact, he made different tools and then find out if the tools indeed improve the group-based learning. So that's another example of how he goes from a general problem statement to research questions and then to designing a new tool. Because, let me stop with it, because that's, I think, the characteristics of most of these dissertations. And again, in our context of instrumentation technology, in our case, and again, that could be different in your case, I don't know that. In our case, almost all these dissertations had, you know, the first part, which was the analysis of the problem and a potential idea about the solution. And then there was a design issue where the PhD students made something. They made a tool, they programmed the tool, or they adapted the tool. Now, I think in most cases they did it themselves, which meant they had some technical skills. In other cases, people didn't have the tool, the technical skills, and therefore they hired somebody else. You know, we had a kind of laboratory in our faculty that was full of people who were technically very, very, very good, and so they could help then the instructors to make what they wanted to make. Now, again, I don't know how this works in your situation, but the same, last remark, Betty, the same is true when from a different angle, and again, that was not our approach given our situation. A number of dissertations we have in the faculty were dissertations who were based upon a secondary analysis of big databases. You know, there is a group, the curriculum development group in our faculty, you know, had the specialty of doing many surveys regularly, worldwide even. And so they had, besides of the first report made by them, you know, about, you know, the direct results of those surveys, there were many data that could be explored and investigated and researched in a more thorough way, looking for connections, correlations, even maybe even causations between different aspects of those databases. Now, this is also a kind of research that could lead to a dissertation very well, of course. Again, I don't have examples of those because we were not directly involved in those. The point is that very often the analysis of these data were not necessarily done by the PhD student. They were done by the people from the group we had in the faculty, which was the data analysis group. And I made the comparison with, you know, the people from the laboratory who were helping with the software development. So I can imagine that in a more general way, you know, more technical skills that you need to analyze your data and to make something in terms of a technical tool. I can imagine that, you know, again, I don't know about your situation, but I can imagine that there is external help available. You can even hire somebody. I had a PhD student from Kuwait who made an electronic portfolio for her students, and she hired somebody else to do the programming. I think there is nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's clear that, you know, the analysis and the writing, et cetera, that should be done, of course, by the PhD candidate. But, you know, the more technical skills, the technical issues that are necessary to go forward can be done by somebody else. It was allowed in our situation. I don't know in your situation, but I can imagine that's the way to go on.
Let me just skip let me skip some to speed along. Just looking very globally now at what Jeff has been saying and what I said before. In general, we see 5 parts to PhD research, and they can overlap and be in different balances. But somehow or other, you have to zoom in on the problem you want to deal with. You have to decide what issues or factors or variables relate to this problem that you want to try to study. You need some sort of methodology, and Jeff has just mentioned that can be of a great variety of things, but from this background analysis, you then have to do something. So there's a first part where you find out what other people have done and think and so forth. Then there's the middle part where you have to do something. You have to do something that's new. And from that you get results, and then you get to the last part, which is to say, okay, with what I did, how now do we know more? How is the field different? Or is practice, could it be different? How are things changed because of what I'm now contributing? So there's an abstract level, a do level, and then back to the abstract level. In very simple terms. Now, thinking about categories of research, especially from our own experience, and now moving into what I'd call the profile that relates to the methodology of what you do. Jeff has also already mentioned some of these, but I'll identify them more systematically. One type is what I'd call the model development or model validation type of research. You either develop a model based on a lot of data and theory, you test it then with a lot of data. Or you validate somebody else's model with a lot of data in order to see if indeed the model still is well expressed or if now you can offer new perspectives on it. So that's one type of familiar research. For that you need a large data set, large, not enough to have one survey or one questionnaire. You need a lot of data to do model testing. like hundreds of subjects per, there's rules based on the number of variables about the number of subjects you need to have, so large data sets. Another type of research is a research where, from the analysis of the problem and the focus on the variable that can make a difference, you set up an experiment. This is familiar educational research. You do an experiment. Now there's many types of experiments you can do. The weakest type is just to do an experiment in your own class. The stronger type are to have comparisons, where you alter a variable, you do it one way in one setting, another way in another setting, and you see if you can attribute any differences in results of your dependent variable to the differences in the independent variable. That's classic educational research of a certain type. And usually you need more than one experiment. Whatever the first experiment shows, you want to see if that was just if it was influenced heavily by other factors. So you should try it again. Typically, with our dissertations, when there was experiments involved, there were usually 3. I don't know why 3, but probably because it was 4 years.
Given the time, yeah.
Yeah. And each one you learn something more that leads into the next one. So you refine something for the next time around. Design research is very familiar in our research. With design research, you analyze a problem, you argue that a certain approach may help, and then your methodology is actually to design this approach. It may be a new type of software, but it may be a new type of pedagogy, and maybe a new type of operating procedure or planning procedure. You design something, and you have to try it. You have to try it in practice, and you have to then analyze its implications on what happens. This usually requires some iterations as well, because each time you try it, you learn a bit more, you improve your process, you improve the thing you designed, your plan, or your curriculum, or your pedagogical approach. And then you try it again, again. And then the last type is case study research. Case study research, you still need those first 2 elements. You have to identify key variables that can distinguish and vary among different cases, and what you think is going to be the relationship among those variables. Then you do the case studies. There's very particular methodologies for case studies. It's hard to do case study research well, and you certainly need a number of cases to do case study research and then compare the cases. And research may involve some combinations of these as well. You may treat your iterations of a design approach as cases, or you may treat your experiments as cases. But in our recollecting, it seems that these were 4 typical ways to profile dissertations. Given this, what do we think isn't a dissertation? Well, we don't think a literature review in itself is enough. We don't think asking other people's opinions is enough. We don't think doing something yourself and thinking about it is enough. All those are part of a larger whole, and we think that larger process has to be there. So you need this broad awareness of literature. You need a conceptual framework that integrates the variables that you're interested in. And then you need to do something and see if your ideas are leading to change or better insight. So you need to do something yourself, not just ask other people's opinions. We've seen dissertations when we've been asked to be external on the external committees, where there were a number of different rounds of Adelphi procedure, and then the dissertation is over. Usually, I don't think that's enough. There can be differences. Perhaps out of that comes some new theoretical insight that changes the model, that you can then round the whole thing off. That can be. in general, we think those three main parts need to be there. Do you want to show some examples of these three parts, and then?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe a supplementary remark to what Betty is saying, that maybe I should show the dissertation first. Okay. Talking about the different dissertations, again, most of the ones that we have here are design dissertations, and I talked to you that already. I brought two other ones on which we were on the committee, which I would like to call, well, I have three of them, case studies. One is, this one. This is done by another group of our faculty, the instructional technology group. It's called Opportunities for Reflection, Email and the Web in Primary Classroom. It's quite interesting dissertation in the sense that it looks at the impact of using the internet and email by pupils in primary education, and in a way they were collecting then the reflections of those students, of those pupils, and they looked for if the use of these emails improved their reflections about issues. And in a way, you could say that, that they went to different classes and so on. So this in a way, in my opinion, is a kind of example of a case study approach. Now, in terms of the remark of Betty about, is this enough? Clearly it was approved. But, of course you understand there is no clear-cut yes or no in these issues. So this is one example. Another example is a very nice example by another person. Oh, here it is. This is done by a person in the curriculum technology department here in the Vista. It's called Design Approaches, a reconstructive study in training and education. What she did, it was a very nice dissertation, she found out what kind of design approaches were used when people were developing all kinds of material in the training and education. So in a way, she had all kinds of she had interviews and reflective research and cases that she studied, and then from that she, in a way, came to a kind of model. So in that respect, it was more than just interviews and looking what happened. She came up with a model that was quite nice. So this is an example of that case study approach. Another nice dissertation is the one by Joseph Kessels, who became later professor and also quite famous in the Netherlands in terms of his own company. He was advising the corporate sector. It's about the corporate sector, and he wrote about two words: design standards for curriculum consistency and in corporate education. And also he in a way, the same idea. He talked to many people also because of his profession and his work, his daily work, and then came to a higher level. So that's an important issue. Very nice. In terms of model development, this is a nice dissertation. Betty was the supervisor of that, by Anoush Margarian. She is from Armenia. And she was using the activity theory as the basis for the model to improve what she called the work-based learning. That was the dissertation in the context of the big Shell project. Very nice dissertation. Another dissertation that used models was the one I already mentioned about the telematic support of group-based learning. The interesting thing about this dissertation is, in terms of the type of the dissertation, this dissertation was made as a kind of joint project between our group and the informatics group. And so the informatics group was much more aware than we are, or were and are, about the visualization of models. So in this dissertation, the person under the influence of the informatics group had all kinds of visualizations of the software he was developing. So that's another way of how the modeling can be brought into the dissertation, and if that's appropriate and there is a group who is aware of how it has to be done, then you can do that, of course. And then in terms of the experiments, This is a dissertation by a Chinese person we had in our group, and it's called Cognitive Style, Its Relations to Memory Capacity and Concept Mapping. What she did was she found out in a different number of experiments what the cognitive style of a person in combination with a certain approach in concept mapping did to the comprehension and the learning of that person. And that was a typical situation whereby the theory was available in the wide psychology literature, of course, and then she did experiments, adding to the concept mapping the media aspect to it, and see if that has a kind of different result in the learning of the people.
So, given time, I'll move on to the next two sections, and then we can wrap it up in an integrative way afterwards. We've talked about actually doing the research, but an important part of being a researcher and being an academic is writing about your research. So we'd like to share some thoughts about writing the PhD dissertation, but also other writing. In general, we think dissertation, and it has 6 different parts. And there may not be 6 chapters in your dissertation, but there's a first part in which you introduce the problem, you zero in on the problem, you argue your choice of variables or focuses. You make sure that you substantiate what you are talking about by your awareness and ability to synthesize and recombine existing research. And by the way, a comment here, my belief in a e-learning context, but perhaps possibly in any PhD research, is that most of your research should be new, should be in the last 5 years. Especially if you say not much is known about and you only print research, cite research from 1992, I think, yeah, I think you don't know much about what's been going on. It's fine to have older research if you show this in a historical context. Over the course of time, certain things have been robust enough to stay more or less the same. Other things are now changing given differences in the context. But in general, I look for new research in that research list. Sometimes it's a problem if a candidate has written his literature study some years ago and then wants to just bring it out and use it later. It's usually not good enough in my idea. And the conceptual framework, usually visualized in some way, to show how variables relate to each other. Then I put stars there because the second part of it is what you did. So what's your methodology? What did you do? How do you justify its scientific validity and reliability? What did you, if that's what you planned to do, what did you actually do? What actually came out of it? And then the last part integrates what you did to the whole. Now, in addition to that, certain things we think are necessary. If you use an instrument of any sort, if you give a survey or a questionnaire, you need to make that available to the reader. It needs to be there, probably as an appendix. I always said to people, think of it as if I was going to redo your research, and I have only your book to go on. And I said it was the break your leg problem. You break your leg, you can't do it. I have to take it over. Can I do what you were planning to do? So you need to be very clear about what you did or planned to do so that someone else could, in fact, reproduce it or build on it. Also, your data should all be there. Now, this is sometimes hard, and you might, if you have a lot of interviews and qualitative data, you might have to codify it in some way. But again, any conclusion you make based on your data, the reader should be able to, within the dissertation itself, have a fairly good feeling of if it's justified. So it's not enough to just say 17 interviews were carried out and the result is that people are in favor of da-da-da. Between that sort of summary statement and your process that you yourself did of doing the interviews, the reader, the committee, has to be able to see the basis for your making conclusion. So you need to at least code your interviews in some way that you can argue that this is a close reproduction of the larger context. That's important.
May I give?
Sure.
We completely agree upon this. I think that I always say to my students always ask me, what should be in the appendix, and I say what Betty is saying, the data should be there, and the data it's too large, then you can refer to a database that you have available for the reader eventually, so that the reader, if necessary, can call you up and say, hey, can I have the database? Now, the crucial point about, the conclusions that Betty is talking about is, of course, there are two issues, there are conclusions which can be based upon objective criteria. When you do a test, a test about the means, you can say, effectively, the mean is significantly better than. I mean, that's a fact. That should be clear, that should be reproducible by the reader. Now, your interpretation of that fact, that's another issue. So I can imagine that, that you have, of course, you can your interpretation of what you see. That's yours. The reader, with the same facts, can come to a different conclusion. So, again, it's not clear-cut always what I'm saying now, but nevertheless, that's something you have to think about. Often in my I remember now, when I was on defense committees, often my questions to the candidate were about, his then interpretation of the results, not the results themselves, because you have to assume they are correct. I mean, of course, but the interpretation then is a question. And often what happens is that in the Netherlands there is the custom that the candidate has to write 10 theses, Stellingen, what is it in English?
Well, propositions.
He has to make a couple of propositions that he is willing to defend also. Now,
summary statements.
Statements, yeah. Now, often these statements then are very short. They are not or maybe then there are no nuances, they are clear-cut. And in the clear-cut statements often are picked up by the press and or in other publications. And very often in these clear-cut statements, the nuance that is in the dissertation often is not anymore in the clear-cut statements. And often with a significant difference. So that's another issue that you should be aware of if you want to not misquote it eventually by somebody else. That please be careful about, your clear-cut statements so that they are correct also, in relation to the nuance that are in the dissertation.
I used to always say, also just following that up, that think about the idea of the 2 minutes in an elevator. You're in an elevator with a journalist, and you have between the first floor and the 5th floor, and he says, what did you find out from your research? You should be able to have 1 or 2 sentences that you are ready to say in a very crisp way about your research. So think about the elevator scenario and be ready to describe your problem, what you studied, what you found, and what the implications are within 2 minutes. Try it.
Without using the stop button.
It's very, very hard. Very hard. When I would challenge the students to do this, they suffer. Everybody, you know so much about the problem, you start telling about it. If you want to suddenly be quoted or meet a policymaker or a researcher at a conference that you'd like to connect with, you have to be able to crisply express everything in a few sentences. So practice it. It's very hard. Practice it in several languages as well so that you're ready to do it. Very hard. Let me jump to this slide because I don't think a dissertation like any of these just happens. You need a lot of practice. We believe very much in scaffolding of academic writing. Scaffolding means you help, and each time you do it with a little less help. So this is basically the process that we tried to follow with our PhD candidates. We had a once-a-year meeting. This is the official process, at least at our university. There's a supervisory committee, which is somebody else besides from the main supervisor. In our cases, it tended to be 4 or 5 other people. Once a year, this group meets. Sometimes they can't meet all in the same room at the same time, so you'd use teleconferencing or you'd have email answers, comments in advance. But the candidate prepares a fairly thick document for each of these meetings. And after the first year, this is the official moment when the committee has to recommend that the person goes on or not. So this is a serious moment, because if you agree, then the committee has agreed that this research is feasible, that it can be done. You can't then say 2 years later, well, I can't make this prototype because I don't have any money for it. You have to think of all that before you agree on the plan, or else change the plan. So by the end of the first year, we are all committed to a doable research project. This often means making the research question much more focused. You may start saying you want to improve distance education. Well, you have to focus that a great deal more before you can be confident that the candidate can do something useful in a short amount of time. So basically we had 3 different of these official meetings, each one with a thick report, and the committee gives comments and suggestions and help to the candidate. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Because I found that very interesting, but at the same time I see the word emphasis. So you mean that in year second I can go back to the problem definition?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
Because I think research is something
Oh, sure.
also
And
like
it's usually changing
not
too.
closing
Yeah.
steps.
It's usually changing too, and that may be a large thing that you report, is based on your initial pilot that you did, you went back and changed the conceptual framework or the research question, or, yeah.
I always like to say to candidates, because it's a surprise to them. I said, listen, in my opinion, your dissertation should be a logical description of what's going on, not necessarily a chronological one. Because again, candidates often say to us, hey, but can I change my problem statement? Yes. Nothing. So it should be a logical story, if possible, indeed also at the same time chronological. That is wonderful. In most cases, it's not the case.
Now, I think parallel to the dissertation, it's important to have a plan for academic writing. Or everybody says, I'm too busy. Everybody is too busy and finds it hard to write academic articles. But it's necessary. And it's part of the process of being a respected researcher, is to write academically. So what I did every year with each of my PhD students is I had this routine. The first year, we would write an article together, but I would do most of it, in effect, and they would work with me on it, help me, but under my guidance. Usually made use of their literature review, and that's fine. The second year, I would look for the opportunity where the candidate and I were really joint authors. They did one part, I did one part. So often that was the part, they did the part that was closest to their work, and I would do the part that was a larger context, for example. And then the third year, they were responsible for writing an article themselves. I didn't have my name on it, however, I would help them and make sure that it was good before they sent it out the door. Often I would identify the place for them to publish. I would make the contact with the editor. I would be the one who would have an invitation, and I would respond to it and say yes, but they would be the one who would send the article in with their name on it. The hardest thing is, in fact, to find the right journal and to get accepted. And so a large part of my value in this process was to identify journals where they were likely to get accepted and to help them shape the writing to fit the expectations of that journal. So that was also my contribution. I've often found that there's a tendency to want to go to lots of conferences and then say you don't have time to write a serious paper. I've seen that here at the walk. When I've, in another part of my work here, I look at the scientific productivity on a yearly basis, and I will see from a group, I'll see 80 conference presentations and maybe 5 what I'd call serious journal articles. So it's not the case you don't have time. You take a lot of time to go to all these conferences. I've said this to my students all the time too. Be careful about the time you allot to conference papers. It's not the same thing of writing a conference paper, which is typically shorter, which is shorter, as it is in writing a very serious 20, 25-page research paper, which takes more time and effort and a different kind of skill. So make the time to do that serious paper each year, and then choose 1 or 2 conferences. And usually it's good to use the basis of that paper, but make it into a conference paper, which is something else. It's shorter, it's snappier, it's much more focused on what you did. So that's what I always did with my students.
Yeah, maybe you know, this is our approach in our group, and exactly what Betty is saying. Now, in one other group, I think in 2 other groups in our faculty, in particularly in the instructional technology group, which were much more psychology, learning oriented than we were. Their procedure was that their dissertations were much more based on particularly experiments, like in a way this one, you know. So what they did in a typical way was, you know, they have a learning theory or aspects about it, and combination with media, for instance, you know, and then they did an experiment. One experiment, let's say each year they did 1 experiment. And then the supervisor and the candidate wrote about that experiment and presented it to the journal. So in that case, it's easier than, you know, what we are doing with these more design-oriented research, because we needed, you know, the tool before we could do something, which was typically available at the end maybe or the beginning of the 3rd year. So when you do an experiment, you know, you can do it from the 1st year on, because, you know, your context is much more focused then and easier in a way, you know, to do your experiment. And we had the discussion with our group for many, many years, you know, if we should indeed also go to that kind of approach. Because in their approach, you know, the dissertation then is in a way a combination. It's I'm not saying it's not good, but it's a bundling of their articles. So the dissertation is typical. The first introduction to the chapter, experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, experiment 4, and a conclusion. And then the experimental chapters were in most cases written by the candidate and the supervisor. I remember discussions within committees, you know, saying, hey, here are 4 chapters in the dissertation. Who was the main author? The main author. So you can get this kind of discussions then. But that's another approach. And again, it really depends on the circumstance, on the context again. In our case, that didn't work out very well at all.
Well, the last one you just supervised, RIA, that was made that way.
Yeah, right.
And conceptual
Mm.
argument at the beginning, and then 3 published journal articles.
Yeah, the problem there was, you know, that the second article was not accepted in the first place to begin with. So it took a long time before, and then she was disappointed. It was a very smart woman. Then she was disappointed, and so she let her you know, adrenaline go down, and so the whole research was slowed down. So I mean, this was a consequence of this. Is eventually she made it, so that's fine. But
After
so
7 years. Okay, the time is running short, so we haven't said anything about e-learning yet. Now, implicitly, as Jeff said earlier, everything we do relates to technology and learning in some relationship. So if that's a general definition of e-learning, it's permeated all of our comments. But we thought in particular about 2 lines of contribution. Jeff already mentioned, be specific about what you're taking as e-learning when you use the term. because you may have a good shared understanding here about what e-learning means, but believe me, in different places, people will interpret it differently. It's become very hard to put a boundary around now as we use technology all the time and everything we do. It's very hard to say where it becomes e-learning and where it isn't e-learning. For that reason, we think the second point is important. It's probably more useful to focus on some problem or issue, and then within that, how the e-learning context or technology is related, either as part of the problem itself or as part of one of the factors that make an impact on the problem. So that means your literature review will have some literature that relate to the problem. If you're worrying about students' motivation, for example, in distance learning, some literature on motivation is highly relevant, even if it isn't done in a distance learning context. However, many other pieces that relate to technology-supported learning and its relationship with motivation then do matter. In particular, you have a wonderful opportunity now in the eLearn Center to make linkages, because a big problem with a dissertation is the person gets so wrapped up in the dissertation by the end of the 4 years, it's very difficult to know to think about anything else but your own work. It's important to continually see your work in a bigger, broader conceptual network. So you have a way to do that on an ongoing basis here in your e-learning center. As you get together, routinely look for ways to see how your research links with others. And that relates to the recommendations we have for you as the management of the center. And that's the column on the right, and that's the end of our plan remarks. You have the great opportunity now, but also the big job of, I think, making these linkages visible on a regular basis. That means you have to move beyond a list of topics and titles. I'm picturing at least 5 different concept maps that you could generate that show the relationships among research based on these 5 different types of aspects. From this, you can stand above the research of individuals and see what messages are emerging, either about methodology or about interventions or about results or about implications or about conceptual frameworks. I don't think the individual PhD project in itself can do this sort of synthesis as well as you can do when you have a number of projects that you can treat as data points and try to visualize the relationship. So I recommend that together you work on these conceptual maps that that show relationships among your projects and show things that emerge from the sum of all your projects. The beginning ones, the ones that are nearly finished. This is of great help to new projects that are starting, because they can see where they can fit in to the dynamics of what's already been going on. But it's also an important way for you as a center to consolidate and build upon your work. You need to take advantage of the fact that you go beyond the individual, and you can bundle each year 20 different research projects or so and see what comes out of them. And this leads to our very last point on the list. I remember we were talking about time as a factor in e-learning as a central theme in your research. We can't tell from the list of titles which we got how time is going to emerge out of these current research projects. Probably many of them started before you chose the topic, so that's not surprising. But even so, as time, we all agree, is a valuable construct to explore, now's a good time to see where time has any sort of linkage to the existing projects. In one or more of these 5 ways, each of your projects should be able to be seen in some way to relate to something about the time construct as a variable, but you might have to dig very hard because it might not be an obvious X or Y variable, but something maybe in the methodologies you use, which are also appropriate for studying other questions, or in the sorts of limitations you have for data collection, for example, or this can also be seen from the filter of how does this relate to time as a construct in technology-supported learning. So I think this is valuable for you to all put your collective thoughts together to see how your own project, which may not have thought about time at all as a factor, but how it can offer something now to the evolving construct development of time for the center. So those are our thoughts. And we'll stop.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ens queda estona per alguna pregunta. Llavors, jo només faig la feina, diguéssim, de moderar-ho si n'hi ha més d'una, si no, n'hi caldrà, no? Però espero que sí. Per tant, qui tingui interès en fer preguntes o apuntar alguna qüestió, algun comentari.
Everybody's changing the subject all the time. I think they don't, when they found a problem, a real problem that is too difficult, we abandon it. And there's a new buzzword, personal learning environments, augmented reality. And you see the authors changing all the time. I'm not going till the end of a question, because it's too difficult to answer, so we'll go to a new one. For sure we'll be accepted in a conference. This is my impression.
We've seen that from Web 2 now as a whole situation for, oh, it's new, it's new.
I always like to, I completely agree with you. I have 2 comments, I always made the remark about, the alibi around the corner. People said, we are doing this and that, but, there are all kinds of problems and we don't know how to solve them. And then somebody says, wait a minute, look around the corner. There is a new technology coming up, and that will solve all your problems. Well, it will not. But that's common. But more seriously, one of the problems we had with all our dissertations, I think with all of them was, in fact, what Betty was sketching, is you do you start with your context, etc. You have your hypothesis, you think what kind of relationships are going to be researched. In our case, you make your prototype, and then you investigate in your own context. Most cases, you find out if it works. Sometimes it works, then you adjust your prototype anyway. But then the third phase should be that what you found out as being stable in your own context, that should be then transported to a broader context, the school sector or whatever, or more classes external, and then find out if it still works, because the context there will be different, or may be different. Now the point was that at that third stage, we never came. Because the time was up. And because there was a new technology. And that's, I think, one of the major problems in our field, and also I think therefore in e-learning, that by default, we don't have the time to do the research as it should be, till the end, I mean. We always stop in the middle somewhere because the reasons you gave. And that's a real problem, because even in terms of, but they didn't talk about it, in terms of being taken seriously as a researcher. Because of that problem I'm sketching, you know, the theory building, the underlying conceptual building of what's going on, theories, you know, almost never happens, because we never come to stable results. And therefore, many people in our field, well, maybe they don't say it, but, you know, but we know that when they compare, let me call it experimental research versus design research, we put it in these two categories, the design research folks, we are by many of the others not taken seriously. And the reason is understandable. I understand that, because, you know, they are working based on theories and checking the theories again and again and again and again. And we are not able to do that. I'm now generalizing it, but it's a serious point. We are been talking about these and discussing about this all our career, and it's still going on. It's still going on. So I think you have to find a way to get around this, and I think that I don't think I once made somebody asked me, what about the future of technology? I said, listen, as far as I'm concerned, which is like a joke, you know, as far as I'm concerned, as an education, technology should stop developing for 10 years.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Then we will have the time, you know, to learn about it, to experiment it, and come to conclusions. Of course, it will not happen. I know. So the question is how to make the fact that other people, because we are dependent upon opinions of others, that's the way it works in the world, how can we make sure that they take us seriously? And I think by doing, you know, what Betty was sketching, you know, by making your research conceptually, you know, in terms of structure, very, very, very good and solid, and also trying to, what Betty was saying, you know, to get an overview of combining the things you have. So in a way, more improving the process in terms of stability and conceptual fairness and thoroughness, so that others can see this is being done as this is good research. Nobody can argue about that. And then hopefully we will sometimes get the time to, you know, have a more stable situation, and then work upon that.
The good thing about any sort of research related to learning is that the generic problems are going to stay. They're not going to go away. Technologies may change, but if technologies are influence variables, the general problems are still there. You still have teachers who don't change or are too busy, or you have students who aren't motivated or who don't learn. These problems aren't going to go away. So that's good, I suppose. But you need to look at what have we learned from before with other technologies that suggest or give us insights to what we can expect now. So when I like Web 2 technologies very much, for example, but we know from much experience before that instructors have a difficult time integrating technologies into instructional sequences, so we can expect that they're going to have difficulties integrating Web 2 technologies into instructional sequences. We don't have to start with a blank piece of paper and be surprised that instructors have a hard time doing it. We can predict that quite confidently from before, as an example. So, but I agree, it is hard, and if you don't finish your dissertation quickly, you'll be talking about technology which people who aren't thinking about the underlying real problems, you know, but are interested in the technology, they'll say, "Oh, e-portfolios, but didn't we do that already?" You know, and then they want the next technology.
Sylvia?
Thank you.
The second thing I would like to say is that even I think it's good in order to have a good community to start introducing ourselves I'm at the eLearn Center, but I'm not doing a PhD in learning, and I have not done a PhD in learning either, so, but I'm working with the dissemination and with the exploitation of the system. So
Good.
I am here also, and I'm really happy to be part of this community. I was following your interesting conversation and trying to think about technology, and we are not going to stop technology, but shouldn't we try to design our research more tool independent, which is not technology independent, but tool independently, and then study how the tool itself may affect our results as a bias to the main result of our research?
No, well, in our terminology here, that's what we meant by, just a second.
Second point.
The first thing is the general question or issue, which in itself isn't technology. But then the second part, what I called here generally this influence variable or impact variable, that's the different tools or the different ways the tools can be used or the different characteristics of the tools. Those are the influence variables. And can we show that they make a difference to the general problem that we're interested in? So, good. And since you're involved with dissemination, you'll be a good person to work with the rest of the center on that very last slide I show, looking for integrative views of the projects.
Joan?
Yes, I also want to thank you for your presentation, especially for the last part where you have advised us for what amount and quality level of publications we should aim. I think it's reasonable to think of 3 or 4 publications and doing them in crescendo from local conference to a journal level. But there's also a problem that we often are under pressure to publish and as soon as possible and as high as possible, and then this creates noise in the doctoral students and supervisors, and I think that your approach is reasonable, and it's also somehow slow philosophy, which is good for health and for quality. And another thing that I wanted to comment on is that from what I know from eLearning, it's a nice area because it's a crossroads. It's somewhere where people from different backgrounds meet.
Yeah.
Psychology, pedagogy, IT, management, and these it's nice. It's multi-area by essence, and this gives opportunities, for example, for publishing, not just in psychological aspects of learning, if your problem has them, but also in management aspects or in IT aspects. But at the same time, what I see is that this is also a risk, because people having to evaluate your work sometimes or your proposals, they are looking for boxes, and they say, but what is this guy proposing? Is this pedagogy or IT or management or so how would you counsel a PhD student or a supervisor that is entering eLearning on how to sell books research in a way that this risk is minimized?
Yeah, we had. I wish I had an answer, because we are fighting with this problem all our career. You know, the clearest thing was when we sent in research proposals. Often our proposals were turned down, and or they were not what they called, or there was no theoretical framework, or not clear enough, or it was not technical enough. You know, when we sent it to the social sciences research councils, you know, we were often turned down as being not scientific enough. That's the discussion about experimental research and design research. It's still going on. Or we sent it to a more technical group, and they said, I once remember I said, it doesn't matter now. Then it was not technical enough, you know. Then because So we are always in between. I had arguments with all kinds of people all my life. I don't have a solution. On the one hand, I see in many publications that, the multidisciplinary approach is being propagated, is being said, yes, that's correct. I completely agree because, again, the context for us is the basis of everything. Now, the context in which we're doing research is complicated. If you take a very small size, which is necessary to make it clear, at the same time, it's difficult to generalize because it doesn't fit. So the context is very important. On the other hand, at the same time, when you send in the research proposal, taking that into account, you get probably the comment, not scientific enough, because people who have to judge it, each of us have their own personal context and history and, framework of mind, which is understandable. And so everybody looks at these things from their perspective. So you have to find somebody who has indeed the same multidisciplinary broad approach that can understand what the value of your proposals are. If you don't find that person in the main position, then you're gone. So I don't know the answer. Well, the answer is, to make sure that your friends, colleagues, are in the main positions to make decisions about research.
It's here for that. It's yes.
I think as a final comment to that, although I tried to do it occasionally, I tried to make this kind of concept map about the different types of, or the different research projects that I and my colleagues were involved in. I tried to show how these were all integrated around a central question, and in that way I tried to look for a way to see a connection among them rather than to see them as different things for different audiences. It wasn't so much a problem with, for me in my professional life. I had different reputations, I think, in different fields. But as Jeff said, the real problem comes when you have to be evaluated by an educational committee, and half the articles which I would have in a computer science journal, which I knew were a big accomplishment, they say, this isn't on our list, it's nothing. So that is where we had frustration.
Marcelo?
Maybe it's a question for, I think it's interesting for everybody also, I hope. My name is Marcelo Mana, and I'm a PhD candidate and I work at work also as a teacher. Following the idea of interdisciplinarity, my question was about advising. Should this e-learning dissertation have more than one advisor if we are really working on an interdisciplinary field? Should it be advised from people from the educational scene and from software engineering, for example?
What we did very deliberately when we formed the committees, that by the way, there are maybe in more detail, there were in our case always two supervising committees. There was the one which was starting at the first year, which was Betty was talking about, and there is a formal one at the end of in the law in the Netherlands. Before you can have a PhD, there has to be a formal appointed committee that then approves your dissertation. Now, in most cases, the committee we started with at the beginning eventually became the formal committee. But there could be differences. Now, the point was from the first committee was really, I think the most important one, because that committee helped the student going along. We deliberately tried to get at least one person out of the faculty to begin with, and, if possible, with a different professional background, in order to make sure that you are not, you didn't have a tunnel vision, or the candidate. We did it, yeah, absolutely.
But in several, Jeff led a big project, I thought you'd mention it, in which we had a number of PhDs which were deliberately jointly supervised by computer science and by us. And that generally went well, but it made it very clear to me that there's different languages and different frameworks for methodology that are important to find a bridge between and to synthesize. What was very, very frustrating for us after 4 years of doing this, quite of the 4-year projects, quite happily making it through, then we found out that when it came time to actually put the dissertation on the official records, the computer program where you have to fill in the supervisor would only take one name. Absolutely, could not put in 2 names. And so at the official moment of presenting the dissertation, although we really had worked as colleagues on all of these, one person had to be officially named, and his group got the money. I was so angry about this. I'm still angry about this. So that was an example of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Just could not understand something other than there's a field. It accepts one name. A drop-down window where you select one faculty. You could not select 2.
I would like to comment on the previous question about, the multidisciplinary approach. What you see in the Netherlands now, but also at the European level, it's very clear that ICT, that e-learning, to begin with, is being seen as, I'm not saying less important, but that the explicit mentioning of e-learning as a topic is not going down, but is being integrated, I think, quite correctly with other issues. So it was funny that I had to give a talk in Slovenia last year for the European Union of Unions or something, and they had a project that started, I think, 5 or 7 years ago, and subfunded by the European Union. And the project started, and in the name it was still there. It was about e-learning. And so they got the first phase, 4 years, and then they went to the second phase, I think 4 years or 3 years, whatever. And I was surprised. I mentioned in my talk, I was surprised to see that in the naming of the project in the second year, they took away the e-learning, and they called it again ICT. I made a comment about how fast things are changing, but I think it's important. I mean, in a very practical sense, it's important for when you're defining projects, naming projects, and asking for project money. You have to realize. I don't know about Spain, but certainly in the Netherlands it's absolutely clear, and also European level. E-learning in itself, which was very focused, a very strong, a strong point, years ago, it's not going away. It's integrated in other issues, and therefore, again, what Betty was saying in the beginning, the problem that you focus on, that's important, and then e-learning comes along as maybe a solution. E-learning in a particular way, then, as a solution for your problem. That's important to realize. And that will go on and on and on. I mean, in 4 years' time or in 3 years' time, something else will. So.
Okay. Any other comment?
I just wanted to make one more comment to. Sorry, I forgot your name already. Don's question or observation earlier about being forced to write too quickly. I should have been more specific here that I saw a linkage between this article each year and this thinking over here. So the first year is much more the conceptual review article. The second year is much more zooming in on what could be key variables in investigating it and how these could be operationalized. And then the third year is much more what you did and what your data are. So with that framework in mind, you're not talking about your own work really between the second and the third year. So that helps prevent premature reporting.
So thank you very much again.